Welcome back. As we mentioned earlier, tonight we are looking at rape, what constitutes rape, what doesn't, and the legalities around it. We spoke to Kathleen, Director of Rape Crisis, to answer these questions. Let's take a look.
So something that Rape Crisis has been doing for a long time is looking at this concept of rape culture. What is rape culture? And the way that we thought about it is all the myths and stereotypes that people have about rape, about women, about sex. Those are all the things that go into making up rape culture. And so we try to think for ourselves, what is it that would be the opposite of rape culture? Because if you want to challenge something without building something new in its place, then it just becomes something destructive as opposed to something that you're trying to create. And so we came up with this idea of a culture of consent. Just reading widely on social networks and in social media, and particularly on university campuses, the idea of a culture of consent started to emerge. And there are very many different ways of thinking about it. If you think about just the meaning of the word consent on its own, it's permission. It's giving somebody your permission to engage with them in a sexual encounter of whatever kind, because we're talking about it specifically in the context of rape. So if there's no consent, if there's an absence of consent, then something forcible has happened or something coercive has happened. And in the worst case scenario, that can be a crime, and you can go to jail, and there's a minimum sentence of 10 years for that. So everybody has a vested interest really in understanding what consent is and how we give consent and how we gain consent and how important consent is in our sexual relationships, regardless of what kind of relationship it is, whether you've known the person for 3 seconds or 3 years or you're married. Consent is still a fundamental issue in sexual relationships. So if you're mutually consenting adults in a sexual encounter, that's exactly what it means. It's mutual. Each person has to give their consent. Both parties have to give their consent. And the responsibility lies equally with both of those people to give or withhold their consent. So it's not like the power rests more with the man or more with the woman. If you're mutually consenting adults, you both have a right to refuse, and you both have a responsibility to give or withhold your consent. If you agree to this and then this type of a sexual act, and then the person wants to do that kind of a sexual act, it's absolutely rape if they go ahead with that act without your consent. So that's why a lot of groups, a lot of activist groups, specifically also on university campuses, have taken up this idea of enthusiastic consent. So you can be coerced into giving your consent as well. You can give your consent even though you don't really want to do something. So that on paper or technically you've given your consent, but actually the law in our country makes provision for the fact that you might have been forced to give your consent as well. So this concept of enthusiastic consent is starting to be used in advocacy circles and lobbying groups, and just getting people to have a conversation about that. What does that mean? So it takes quite a bit of the subtlety out of sex, which is a bit of a pity, because sometimes the unspoken is what is special and important about a sexual encounter. So it's really when you're in those grey areas and you're not certain that you have to be explicit about what it is that you're doing.
And then when there's a consent issue, you have to prove it. So what I want to ask, if it happens to, let's say, me or whoever, people are told to generally fight or just lay still. So what is the accurate thing that you need to do?
I think it's very difficult to prove that you didn't give consent in a court of law, and it's also difficult for the other person to prove that you did give consent. So it becomes very much a he said, she said kind of a situation in a court of law. And it's going to very much depend on the testimony that you give, how strong your testimony is and how consistent you are. But I think in terms of giving people advice about how to handle a situation where you haven't given your consent and the person is going ahead, you have to decide for yourself in that moment whether you're going to fight or not. But sometimes it's not even a decision. People just respond out of fear, so they're very frightened in that moment. Now some people, their natural instinct, even if it's a very bad idea, will try to fight. And sometimes it's a bad idea to fight because it makes the other person more aggressive, and then they might hurt you and they might kill you. 12 people in every 1,000 die in a rape situation. Not necessarily because fighting back, but they end up dead. Other people in that moment of fear will freeze. They will absolutely just become paralyzed by their fear. And then there's a third group of people who try to run away. So they will try everything that they can do to escape and run away. So those three, fight, freeze, or flight, are the kind of very deep-seated, impulsive reactions when you're under a threat. So it depends how frightened you are in that situation. It depends how out of control or in control you feel in that situation. Sometimes you can make a decision because you're in a position to make a decision, and then you have to decide and trust yourself as to what the best decision is, whether it's to fight, to flee, or to freeze. And you have to make up your mind based on your own judgment. No one can tell you in advance what the right thing is to do, because it depends on the other person, it depends on your environment, your physical environment, it depends on so many factors. Maybe that person has a weapon. So there are all sorts of things. Maybe that person just has enormous power over you. So they might be very much physically stronger than you. Those are all factors that you can't predict or know in advance. And so there isn't like a recipe for prevention or a recipe for how to protect yourself, or that will be successful under all circumstances. Yeah. Such a lot of there's so many bad stories that get told about the police, give them a bad name, and then people don't want to go and report, whereas in fact mostly they are excellent. But occasionally you will find somebody who isn't going to be sympathetic, and I think particularly when it comes to male rape, it makes people feel very uncomfortable personally. And then all of these stereotypes come out, people put their guard up, they try to find it funny, or they don't take it seriously. But in fact, if that happens to you as a man, you have a right to complain to the station commissioner, to come to an organization like Rape Crisis, to report it to the Civilian Secretariat for Police. There are various mechanisms that you should complain about it, because it's absolutely your right to report the crime and have that crime investigated exactly as any other crime would be. I think people really don't actually appreciate how serious it is, and that a 10-year minimum sentence it's a heavy sentence. So to think that you, just by misreading a person and not really ensuring their enthusiastic consent, you can end up in jail for 10 years. That should really be a very powerful deterrent. It really should. Well, sentencing law also will say that if it's a first offence, the minimum sentence is 10 years, but obviously if it's a second offence, it's going to be a higher sentence the next time. By then, let's say you've spent 30 years in jail. Do you know what I mean? It's a long time. So repeat offenders obviously get higher sentences than first-time offenders for any crime, not just for rape. So that's quite an important thing to remember as well. And also remember, 10 years is the minimum sentence. The judge can give you more. So if there are aggravating circumstances, so if you've committed violent acts aside from sexual acts, so if you've harmed the person in other ways, or there are other crimes on top of that, like let's say you've committed crimen injuria, which is insulting a person. So there's a particular way that things that you might have said to the person while you were raping them actually add to the crimes against that person and to the rape. the sentence. So the more that you do to that person, in addition to the sexual offence, the more can be added onto the sentence.